I guess I probably should ask for a show of hands, who does not have the handout for 1 Samuel 1 and 2? Okay. Wait. Yeah. Yeah, it's front and back. It's a front and back. We did 1 Samuel 1. You left yours at home. Oh, okay. Well. Okay. Well, 1 Samuel 1. We covered 1 Samuel 1 last Thursday. We're going to cover 1 Samuel 2 this morning. And then hopefully next week we'll cover 1 Samuel chapter 3. Mark provided us with this map here, which I know that you probably can't see all the way from the back. But you see the two boxes in the top left and the top right are pointing to that dot, which is Shiloh. That is where our story is taking place. So you can see there's the Dead Sea down at the bottom, there's the Mediterranean Sea way off to the left, and Shiloh is that spot in the middle. That's where all this is taking place. There we go. There we go. All right.
Thank you.
Now you can see. All right.
There you go.
Yes. Okay. Shiloh is that dot right there in the middle that all the boxes are pointing to. I may need this board at some point, but I'll leave it for now. You need the sheet too. Okay. All right, 1 Samuel chapter 2. Last week, of course, we looked at Hannah's request for a son, and she is barren while her rival wife, Peninnah, is not. And in response to that, she promises to vow her son and dedicate him to the Lord for as long as he lives if God gives her a son. And God grants her request. She gives him a son, but he gives her a son, and she names him Samuel. And she dedicates Samuel to the Lord at the end of chapter 1 at Shiloh. And this is where our story is going to take place this morning. In 1 Samuel chapter 2, the first 10 verses are devoted to a song of praise that Hannah sings at the tabernacle when she presents Samuel for dedication. Can I get a volunteer to read the first 10 verses?
My Lord, my heart
All right. Now, just looking at that song, one thing that kind of jumped out at me was this phrase that appears at both the beginning and the end of the song. And what was that phrase? Okay, yeah. In verse 1, my horn is exalted in the Lord. And in verse 10, he will exalt the horn of his anointed. So therein you have that idea as well. Now there's something else. I didn't put this on the question sheet, but I may have mentioned this before actually. The book of Samuel, 1 and 2 Samuel, were originally one book together. And at the end of 2 Samuel is another song that does something very similar. In 2 Samuel chapter 22, David, he sings his big song of deliverance. And at the end of it, he talks about, in verse 51, well, in verse 3, he calls God my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold and my refuge. But in verse 51, the last verse of the song, it says, He is a tower of deliverance to His king and shows loving kindness to His anointed, to David and his descendants forever. So Hannah's song ends with a description of how God will strengthen His king and strengthen His anointed and exalt His anointed. And David's song ends the same way, with God exalting His anointed one, only this time it's more specifically identified as David as that anointed one. You see how 1 Samuel 2 and 2 Samuel 22 act as bookends to the whole thing, and it kind of tells the story in a way. In 1 Samuel 2, we learn there's going to be an anointed king. In 2 Samuel 22, we learn that David was that anointed king at the end of the story. So that foreshadows the book's focus on the kingship. What would you say... This song, I've got a few questions about this song, I guess. What would you say this song teaches about God's relationship with the mighty men? Is He all buddy-buddy with them? Okay, He brings them low, He exalts the weak, and actually this whole song is characterized by a series of reversals. First of all, God is depicted as holy and unique. There's no one holy like the Lord, verse 2. There's no one besides you. There's no rock like our God. And then the song kind of goes into this series of reversals. In verse 3, it warns against pride and arrogance. In verse 4, we see that the bows of the mighty are shattered and their weapons are destroyed. And also in verse 4, we see that the feeble and the weak are given strength. The full have to hire themselves out for bread in verse 5. You get people who, I'm satisfied with bread. Well, no, they have to hire themselves out for bread. Well, what kind of picture is that painting? What are they doing? Why would they hire themselves out for bread? They need it. They're not full anymore. So the full have been made empty in that respect. They're living day to day, as it were. They have to eat and provide food for themselves just to get to their next meal. Meanwhile, of course, in verse 5, the hungry cease to hunger. Jesus kind of echoes this a little bit in His Beatitudes when He talks about those who hunger and thirst. They will be filled. Matthew's version says they will hunger, and blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. And the barren, verse 5, gives birth to 7 children, while the mother of many becomes very sad all of a sudden. Of course, the assumption in this passage is that having a lot of children is a good thing and a desirable thing. Our culture has unfortunately corrupted that idea by claiming that, you shouldn't have too many children, that's going to be a burden. Children are wrongly seen as burden instead of blessing today. That's something entirely contradictory to the Bible's view on the matter. In verse 6, the dead are made alive. In verse 7, the poor are made rich, and the low are exalted. In verse 8, the poor are raised from the dust and sit with the nobles. So there's a lot here to say about reversal. God taking people who are in one situation and putting them in the opposite situation. Why would Hannah sing about that? Yeah, well, she's the one who's been in that situation. She was barren and now she has a son. Before the story is over, she's going to have 5 more children. She doesn't quite make it to the 7 that are described in this song. She only gets to 6, but the point nevertheless remains the same. That God is a God who reverses fortunes and circumstances. God is a God of reversal. In verse 6, there's a very important point made. What does this song teach about God's authority over life and death? He has control over it. Okay, all right. He has both the authority to kill and to make alive. We see the same thing in Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 39. In the Song of Moses, this very point was made about God's authority over life and death. It says, "See now that I am He, and there is no God besides me. It is I who put to death, and I who give life. I have wounded, and it is I who heal, and there is no one who can deliver from my hand. Indeed, I lift up my hand to heaven and say, as I live forever, if I sharpen my flashing sword, and my hand takes hold on justice, I will render vengeance on my adversaries and repay those who hate me." This is kind of an important thing. Why would God have authority over life and death? Why would God have the right? What gives God the right to kill people? Some people have a problem with that. Okay, yeah, God's the one that gave life in the first place, right? Some people, especially people who want to attack the Bible and God and His credibility, will say, well, what's God doing killing people? Well, God's the one that gave it life in the first place. And the fact that inherent in creation is His authority to give life, and inherent in that authority to give life is the authority to take it back. And this is, just as God gave mankind the breath of life in Genesis 2 and verse 7, He has the authority to take it back at any time He so chooses. Abraham believed that God could give life to his dead body, life to Sarah's dead womb. And he believed and hoped against hope that God would be able to provide such a thing. Romans 4 talks about that. Hebrews chapter 11 indicates that Abraham offered Isaac. Why? Because he believed that God was able even to raise the dead. Because God tells him to kill, God has the authority to do that. Abraham also believed God had the authority to give life as well. A God that can cause one, can demand the other. And of course, it's the same belief that Hannah expressed when she prayed for a child in her barren, dead womb. And the Lord provided. And it's the same belief we express fundamentally when we believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. If we believe that Jesus was raised from the dead, we should also believe that God will give life to our mortal bodies as well. And this is kind of a crucial text when we talk about God's justice. Why did God command, do not murder? What? I mean, is it just because, killing things is inherently wrong without Him saying so? Yeah. God has authority over life and death and has the right and purpose to dictate the circumstances in which it might be taken away. I mean, that seems pretty straightforward to me. The same God that said do not murder also specified a death penalty for the murderer. Well, I mean, some people claim that's a contradiction, but it's not, because it comes from the same God who has that authority and that power over life and death. He can specify who lives and who dies. It's His rule. And so when God says do not murder, He's exercising that rule. It's another reason why it's the reason why God can direct warfare in Deuteronomy 7 and Deuteronomy 20. That gives people some trouble sometimes. But if God can kill and make alive, He can direct others to kill and to make alive as well. It is His divine prerogative as the giver of the breath of life. Anyway, now that I've gone off on that tangent, I hope that that's something useful in some way. In verse 8, it says the world rests on pillars, probably not intended to be taken literally. I would caution against using poetic texts as a... sometimes you'll see people use poetic texts in the Bible as evidence of, quote, scientific foreknowledge. There's a passage in Isaiah that says the world is round. Well, yes, but it's also speaking in this poetic type format, and you don't want to set a precedent of stretching texts like that and taking them over literally. I'm kind of skeptical of that kind of approach to reading the Bible. The earth rests on pillars here in 1 Samuel 2. A similar statement is made in Psalm 75 in verse 3. But no one ever interprets that as being evidence of the discovery that the world's really sitting on top of giant pedestals. No. It's all that to say, be careful about how we interpret poetic texts. Verse 9, the wicked perish, the righteous endure. That's kind of the gist of passages like Psalm 1. The Lord thunders in verse 10. He thunders in the heavens. In verse 10, the word for thunder, I was intrigued to learn this. It's the same word that's used of Peninnah irritating Hannah in verse 6 of chapter 1. In verse 6 of chapter 1, it says, her rival, however, would provoke her bitterly to irritate her or to thunder her. But in verse 10 of chapter 2, the Lord thunders in the heavens. Ultimately, we might say that God has answered Hannah's rival Peninnah by giving Hannah this child. She is in some sense, she's the enemies that Hannah is speaking boldly against in verse 1. I think the application goes beyond that. This is more than just a petty interspousal dispute. But what this is it shows how God is the real one who has the right to thunder, not mankind, not Peninnah.
They that provoke shall be broken.
Yeah.
When you read it that way,
Yeah. That's true. Although the two words I think are different in verse 10. But
Yeah, they are.
but yeah, it's right. Right. I mean, it's clearly. I mean, they're clearly in parallel. It's synonymous in meaning, and I think that's the idea that's being made here. The Lord is the one who has that right, not man. There's a lot of song. Oh, one more thing. The expectation of a king in verse 10 is in a positive and favorable light. Sometimes we zero in on 1 Samuel 8 and we act like that's the only passage that talks about what God thought of the king. The truth is that God had no problem with Israel having a king. He had a problem with their reasons for asking for a king in 1 Samuel chapter 8. But the Lord expects Israel to have a king. He foretells it. He prophesies it. He has a positive view of it. It's just a matter of how they get their king. That's the problem, and how they sin in that process. The reference to a future king may even suggest that Hannah is prophesying in some sense. In 1 Samuel 25, Abigail does something similar when she talks to David and she says, the Lord's going to take the kingdom away from Saul and He's going to give it to you and He's going to build you an enduring house. And she's reciting that famous promise to David before Nathan ever makes it. Abigail's speaking ahead of time on that point. Many of the rabbis thought she was one of the 7 women in the Bible who had the Holy Spirit. So that's kind of interesting to note as well. There are a lot of parallels elsewhere in the Bible to the Song of Hannah. I want to look at 2 in particular. Psalm 113. Psalm 113. Psalm 113. Praise the Lord. Praise, O servants of the Lord. Praise the name of the Lord. Blessed be the name of the Lord from this time forth and forever. From the rising of the sun to its setting, the name of the Lord is to be praised. The Lord is high above all nations. His glory is above the heavens. Who is like the Lord our God, who is enthroned on high, who humbles himself to behold the things that are in heaven and in the earth? He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap, to make them sit with the princes of His people. He makes the barren woman abide in the house as a joyful mother of children. Praise the Lord. Now, what does that have in common with Hannah's song? Okay, there's a reference to the barren woman becoming a joyful mother. Good, that's one. Anybody spot another one? Okay, lifting the needy out of the dust. Verses 7 and 8 of this psalm are almost the same as verse 7 and 8, verse 8 of Hannah's song. Verse 8, He raises the poor from dust, He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with nobles and inherit a seat of honor. Psalm 113, He raises the poor from dust, He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes or the princes of His people. It's the exact same thing, basically. I mean, nobles and princes, 2 different words, but it's the same idea, more or less. The Lord, it's again this picture of God as a God of reversal. He Himself is exalted in Psalm 113, but He humbles Himself to know the things that are going on in heaven and earth. Now, there's a number of ways that God does that. He's so high and mighty and exalted. Why should He care about the human race? Well, He does care. He cares enough to humble Himself. Ultimately, that's realized in Jesus Christ, when Jesus comes to earth and humbles Himself, becoming man, and humbles Himself even to the point of death on the cross. So that's kind of incredible there. But it's interesting. There's several connections there, and some people think one psalm is quoting the other or sharing the same source. I don't know what to do with that. The other passage that I think is important to look at is in Luke chapter 1. Luke chapter 1. Beginning in verse 46 and reading through verse 55. Mary said, My soul exalts the Lord. My spirit has rejoiced in God my Savior. For He has regard for the humble state of His bondslave. For behold, from this time on all generations will count me blessed. For the Mighty One has done great things for me, and holy is His name. And His mercy is upon generation after generation toward those who fear Him. He has done mighty deeds with His arm. He has scattered those who were proud in the thoughts of their heart. He has brought down rulers from their thrones. He has exalted those who were humble. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent away the rich empty-handed. He has given help to Israel His servant in remembrance of His mercy, as He spoke to our fathers, to Abraham and his descendants forever. Now, what does that song have in common with Hannah's song? And there is more than one answer to this.
Whole bunch.
A whole bunch. Let's list some things.
Probably look on the lowest state of the handmaid, loneliness, not having child.
Okay, yeah. Don. Yeah, that's fundamentally the same idea, isn't it? Yeah, they begin the same way. Gail. Yeah, okay. Yeah, the proud are being broken and scattered. Good. What else? He fills the hungry and sends the rich away empty. There's another one. Okay, you also have in verse 52, you have this rulers being dethroned. It's kind of similar to how the Lord and the humble being exalted. There's God again taking the needy from the ash heap and bringing them, and from the dust to make them sit with the princes of His people. You also have the hungry being filled, the rich being sent away empty-handed. You also have the line in verse 49, holy is His name. Now, that appears everywhere in the Bible, but it also appears in 1 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 2. There's a number of parallels between the Song of Mary and the Song of Hannah. And ultimately, of course, we're going to see that there's some parallels between Samuel and Jesus as well as we read further into the story. Okay, so they're both concerned with the Savior or salvation. Good, yes. Anybody have any others? I'm about to move on from that, but okay. Now, there's a couple ways we can break this down. Can somebody read verses 11 through 21 of 1 Samuel 2?
So Hannah went to Ramah, house, and all his ministers Jehovah, Eli. Now the sons of Eli were based on Jehovah. The custom of the priest was that when any man offered sacrifice, the priest's servant came while the flesh was boiling, with a flesh hook of 3 teeth in his hand, struck it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot, and all that the flesh hook brought up, the priest took therewith. So they did in Shiloh and to all the Israelites thither. Yea, before they burnt the fat, the priest's servant came, said to the man that sacrificed, give flesh to roast to the priest, for he will not have boiled flesh, but raw. And if the man said unto him, they will surely burn the fat first, and then take it flesh as thy soul desireth, then he would say, Nay, but thou shalt give it to me now, and if not, I will take it by force. And the sin of the young men was very great before Jehovah, for the men despised the offering of Jehovah. But Samuel ministered before Jehovah, being a child, girded with a linen ephod. Moreover, his mother made him a little robe and brought it to him here. And when she came up with her husband's offering, she sacrificed. And Eli blessed Elkanah and his wife, and said, Jehovah give thee seed to this woman, for the petition which was asked of Jehovah. And they went unto their own home. And Jehovah visited Hannah, and she conceived, and bare 3 sons and 2 daughters. And the child Samuel grew before Jehovah.
Okay, now there's one thing I'm going to kind of start at the end before working my way back through some of this. What happens to Samuel in this story? I'm skipping to question 9 on the sheet. What happens to Samuel here?
Grew and prospered. Kind of similar to what was said about Christ. He grew in favor with God and men. Samuel was basically doing the same thing here, while the sons of Elkanah are wicked and base men. They're growing out of faith with God and with men.
Yeah. Mark answered questions 9 and 10 there. Samuel grows throughout the story, and the language that's used of Samuel is very similar to the language used of Jesus in Luke 2:52, and in other passages, Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and men. Now, Samuel is being contrasted with the sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas. And so what we're going to see is that Hophni and Phinehas and Samuel are kind of like the opposite characters. And the story alternates between saying Samuel grew and saying Eli's sons were wicked. And Samuel grew and Eli's sons kept being wicked. And Samuel grew some more and Eli's sons did some more wicked things. And eventually Samuel gets word from the Lord that Eli's sons are going to die in chapter 3. And in chapter 4, Eli's sons die. So you see that contrast, that kind of ping-ponging back and forth between those two elements. Why are Eli's sons called worthless men in verse 12? Literally, sons of Belial. Their conduct. What did they do that was just so bad?
Well, that shall they despise the offering.
Okay, so they're stealing from the portions of the offerings? Yeah, that's right. And the expression worthless men, it's a similar expression to what was used in chapter 1 verse 26 where Hannah asked Eli, "Do not mistake me for a worthless woman." Maybe Eli was projecting the behavior of his sons onto her a little bit, I don't know. But this is idiomatic for worthlessness and foolishness. And you know what the real reason they're called this is? It's not the fornication that they're committing in verse 22, and it's not the sacrifice stealing that they're committing in these verses. There's an underlying cause to all of this. What is it? The lack of respect. They did not know the Lord. Yeah. Now, in chapter 3, it's going to say Samuel did not know the Lord. But what's the difference? Chapter 3, verse 7. Chapter 3, verse 7. Samuel did not yet know the Lord, nor had because the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The reason Samuel didn't know the Lord is because God had never spoken to him. Is that what the problem is with Eli's sons? No. The problem here, it's this willful rejection of God. And, what they're doing, well, they're stealing portions from the sacrifices with a three-pronged fork. They steal meat from the offerings before the fat is burned. It's a violation of Leviticus 3:16, which says that all fat belongs to Yahweh. The fat was always supposed to be burned before anybody got a portion of the sacrifice in Leviticus 6 and 7 and in other passages. Yes, Don. Yes, okay, so there's, the emphasis on fat belonging to God. Malachi gives a later rant in Malachi chapter 3 about robbing God. Is a man going to rob God? That's what the priests are doing. And they're doing it to the point where even the uneducated worshiper is going, wait a second. I don't think this is right. And the priest is saying, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm going to pull rank on you. I'm going to take it from you by force. It's just total topsy-turvy. The priests who are supposed to be educating the people in holiness and in serving the Lord are instead the very ones who have become corrupt and stolen from the people. They don't know the Lord. They threaten force. The worshiper knows right and wrong better than the priest does. And in this corrupt environment, verse 18, Samuel serves before Yahweh, wearing the linen ephod. His mother continues to provide clothes for him annually at Elkanah's sacrifice. Let me ask you another question. How does Hannah's song fit with what's said about Hophni and Phinehas in the rest of this chapter? What should we expect? They are probably going to be brought low. You see the contrast, right? Hophni and Phinehas, the great priests. No, they're going to be broken very quickly because they do not know the Lord. And little Samuel, child, humble before God. Well, he's going to be exalted. Done. They don't, this is the problem, is apathy. They don't care. What about Hannah? What happens to Hannah after she fulfills her vow to the Lord? She gets 5 more children. So things go well here. Samuel was not her only son. She kept her vow and dedicated him, and she's not barren anymore. Samuel was the first of many. An almost 6 out of 7 literal fulfillment of what it says in chapter 2, verse 5, that the barren gives birth to 7. But, now we're going to kind of see more of the collateral damage from Eli's sons. In verses 22 through 25, Eli decides to confront his sons. Somebody read those verses? No, 22 through 26, excuse me. What do we think about this warning that Eli gives his sons? Too little, too late. Yeah, how many parents are in that situation, right? Done. He should have done a lot more, shouldn't he? What is Eli's... Well, first of all, in verse 22, we find out not only have his sons been stealing sacrifices, they've been sleeping with the women at the door of the tent of meeting. It seems like every time we turn around, here's another bad thing they're doing. There's nothing redeemable about these guys. Mark.
Another thing about Eli, I hear from the people. Where was Eli during all of this? He was in charge of the temple. Where was he? He wasn't doing his job.
Right,
he was in charge of it. He should have known about this before the people.
Information has leaked back to him. He hears what his sons are doing. He decides to rebuke them on that occasion. This report is not good, which I hear. Yahweh's people circulating. He does make a valid point here that, there is no mediator for them. There is no one to intercede on this occasion. If someone sins against man, God will intercede for him. Well, ultimately, all sin is against God in Psalm 51. And ultimately, even then, you see God acting as mediator through Christ. And ultimately, you see Moses even, he interceded for the people when they sinned against God. But someone sins against God like this, there's no one left to pray for him. It's very similar to the comment that Jesus makes in the Gospels. If you sin against the Son of Man, you can be forgiven. But the one who blasphemes the Holy Spirit, well, he cannot be forgiven, neither in this age or the age to come. The person who sins against the Lord in such a way so as to just thoroughly reject His will, I don't care, I know what He says, but I don't care what He says, I'm going to do whatever I want. That person has no forgiveness. There's nothing that can be done for that person. There is no way that person can be atoned for. There's no room for forgiveness for the high-handed sinners. As Numbers chapter 15 says, the person who sins unintentionally, he can atone for his sin by sacrifice. But the person who sins high-handedly against the Lord, that person, he has blasphemed the Lord. He will be cut off from his people. That's what Eli's sons are doing. And here's a fascinating turn of events. Eli's sons don't listen to him. Why not? All right? What does the text say they didn't listen to him? Because the Lord wanted to put them to death. He was minded to slay them. He was fixing to kill them, we might say. I think so. There's probably something to that. Pharaoh has already rejected the Lord. He's already done this. It's kind of like Satan as well. Satan's already rejected the Lord. The Lord could destroy him right now if he wanted to, but he chooses to let him remain for a little bit to demonstrate his glory through him. Now, Hophni and Phinehas, well, the Lord's planning to kill them. But there's another significance to their death as well. We're going to see that in a minute. Their death will become a sign to both Eli and to all of his household as well. And that's what brings us, let me make sure I'm not skipping questions here. Okay, Eli gives a warning to his sons. Now a warning is given to Eli. Somebody read verses 27 through 36. see how all of these themes from Hannah's song are kind of being played out here. Eli's house is strong, but it's going to be broken. They're full right now, but soon they're going to be begging for bread. There's that idea. But, what is the main warning that's given to Eli here? Or the main statement that the prophet makes to him? You honor your sons above me. That's really what this is. You love your children more than you love me. But Eli's the high priest. Surely he loves the Lord. Oh, no. He apparently loves his sons more. And because he loves his sons more, this is the reason for the harshness of this act of judgment. What is God going to do to Eli? Going to break his house so that there's no one left in it. Well, and the translation of that is a little funny. There is one way to read it where it says there's only going to be one left in it, which would be fulfilled with Abiathar's little survival in 1 Samuel chapter 22. He's the only one that escapes from the slaughter at Nob. But Eli's house is going to be broken. And what's going to happen to the priesthood? It's going to be passed to someone else who is faithful. And because Eli's not going to live to see all of this, he gets a sign to prove that this will come about. Both of his sons will die on the same day. This is actually very similar. Eli also dies on the same day that happens too, in 1 Samuel chapter 4. This is very similar to a later event that we see in Samuel, and this was not on the question handout, but anybody know what this kind of sounds like, this prophecy? Happens later on in 1 Samuel.
All sons.
Yeah. Samuel gives the exact same statement to Saul. He appears to Saul in 1 Samuel 28. They bring him up from the grave, and Samuel tells him that you and your sons will die tomorrow on the same day, and you will be with me. And so that's that whole idea. It is kind of interesting how just as Eli's house is broken to make way for someone new, Saul's house is broken to make way for someone new as well. Eli is, I guess, parallel to Saul in that respect. He makes a comment, why kick the sacrifice in verse 29? Eli's sons are indicted for stealing the fat of the sacrifices, but Eli's indicted too because he let them do it. He let them get away with it. He didn't stop them. Failure to rebuke children adequately, failure to discipline children adequately is a symptom of not loving the Lord enough. Eli didn't care about the sacrifice. Later on, Saul apparently cares about the sacrifice so much that he sets it aside he sets aside obedience for it in 1 Samuel 15. The point isn't that God doesn't care about sacrifice. The point is that you're supposed to obey the Lord. You're supposed to not despise the Lord. And while God promised to give the priesthood to his house forever, he now plans to take away the priesthood from the house of Eli. When was this fulfilled? When did this finally happen? When Samuel became priest? Okay. Anybody know of another passage in the Bible that explicitly says this was the fulfillment of this passage? Jesus is not explicitly said to be the fulfillment of this, but I do think he is a fulfillment of it. Definitely. The priesthood being, he takes away the first in order to establish the second. The book of Hebrews is all about change of priesthood. So yeah, we're right to jump to Jesus. But there's one more passage that explicitly says this fulfills the word of the Lord that was spoken to Eli. 1 Kings chapter 2. I was hoping someone would find it. 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 26 and 27. Somebody read those two verses. Okay. All right, so you see what happens here. Abiathar has the priesthood taken away from him and given solely to Zadok. Now, what in the world does that have to do with Eli? Well, Abiathar is the one surviving descendant of Eli. Okay, let me draw a little quick diagram here so you can talk about what's going on here. Aaron had 4 sons. Okay, Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. Now Nadab and Abihu, they got roasted, so they're not on here. But Eleazar became the high priest, and we don't know much about Ithamar at all. Eleazar had a son named Phinehas, and Phinehas had many sons, all the way down to a guy named Zadok. Zadok becomes priest in the 1 Kings 2 story. Now Ithamar, we don't know a lot about his descendants, but we do know that one of his descendants was Ahimelech. That's what it says in 1 Chronicles chapter 24 in verse 3. And we know that Ahimelech had a son named Abiathar. But we also know that Ahimelech's father was a man named Ahitub. And Ahitub was the son of Phinehas. He was also the brother of Ichabod. And Phinehas was the son of Eli. But these guys are all descended from Ithamar. At some point, and I don't know how this happened, but at some point the priesthood is with Eli and the house of Ithamar instead of with Phinehas. The Bible does not tell us how this came to be. It simply tells us that Eli was serving as priest at Shiloh. But what happens is that Eli's 2 sons die. We don't know anything about what happens to Ichabod, but Phinehas has a son, Ahitub. Ahitub has Ahimelech. Saul kills Ahimelech and pretty much everybody with him, and the only surviving ever left is Abiathar, who is removed from the priesthood when he stands against King Solomon in 1 Kings chapters 1 and 2. So that is ultimately how God fulfills this. It took several generations for that prophecy to be fulfilled. But it did happen in the biblical history, and 1 Kings is very explicit about that. All right, we went a little over. Any comments or questions before we close? All right, next week we will pick up with 1 Samuel chapter 3. Can I get a volunteer to maybe pass these out and